The mother bear did not charge. She looked at him, eyes glistening, as if begging. Her cub lay limp in the snow, barely breathing. And instead of running, Josh reached out with shaking hands. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The silence in the forest was so complete it bordered on sacred. Even the wind dared not stir. Josh stood stock still, the axe still loosely in his hand, its blade glinting faintly under the pale winter sun. That sound, the moan that had pulled him out past the fence line, still echoed in his ribs. Not an animal call of aggression, but something older, raw. It had weight, like a prayer spoken with no hope of an answer. His breath fogged as he inched forward, crunch by crunch across the ice-glazed earth. Just ahead, under the canopy of snow-laced cedar boughs, the grizzly came into full view. Her massive body quivered with each exhale, steam curling from her snout in soft plumes. She was filthy, her fur matted with dirt and crusted with ice, but it was her eyes that froze him in place. They weren't wild, they were wrecked, wide and liquid, not with rage, but something devastatingly close to sorrow. And then there was the cub. Curled beside her forelegs, barely more than a bundle of fur, the young bear looked almost sculptural. Still, breath shallow, the snow rising around its flanks like it might simply disappear into the landscape. Its little paw twitched once, almost imperceptibly. Josh dropped the axe. He didn't move any closer yet. He knew wildness, knew that instinct could flip in a blink. But she didn't tense, didn't rise. Instead, she angled her head, just slightly, toward him. That was the moment it hit him. This wasn't an encounter. This was an offering, or perhaps a surrender. Josh took one slow step, then another, until he stood within 20 feet. The tension in his shoulders was so taut it ached, but he forced calm into his breath. He scanned the cub, pale gums, ragged breath, a slight tremor in the flank. Starving, possibly frostbitten, possibly worse. Still, she let him near. The mother's body remained between him and the cub, but she lowered her head, not in sleep, not in fatigue, but in something like resignation. Josh saw it clearly now. She was not capable of saving her child, and she knew it. But he might be. And so she allowed the unthinkable. He whispered, voice low and steady. "Okay, girl. Let me try." The forest didn't interrupt, and neither did she. Neither did Dad. Inside the cabin, the heat from the wood stove barely kept up with the icy draft sneaking through the old seams of the log walls. Josh had cleared a space near the hearth, rolling out a flannel blanket and nestling the bundled cub atop it, his wool coat still wrapped around its shivering frame. He kept the lights low, just a single oil lamp flickering on the counter. Less for ambiance, more because anything harsher felt invasive, as if brightness itself might shatter what fragile thread the cub clung to. The goat's milk warmed in a dented saucepan on the stove, sweetened with a dab of honey that glowed golden in the light. Josh stirred it slowly, one hand steadying the pan, the other gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He wasn't thinking about the risk. He wasn't thinking about the law. He was thinking about the way the mother bear had looked at him, how she hadn't bared teeth or turned away but watched, unblinking, as he cradled her child and walked off into the falling snow. That stare stayed with him now, stitched into the back of his mind like a silent pact. He ladled the milk into an eyedropper and knelt beside the cub. Up close, its tiny body was even more fragile than he'd realized. Ribs visible, nose crusted with ice, pads cracked and raw. It didn't protest the dropper. Didn't move at all at first. Then, a twitch of the muzzle. A weak suck. Josh exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, forcing back the flood of emotion tightening in his chest. One swallow. Another. A cough. He adjusted the cub's position gently, wiped the corner of its mouth with the cuff of his sleeve, and whispered something low and meaningless. Just sound, just comfort. Outside, the wind picked up, tapping pine branches against the tin roof in soft, arrhythmic thuds. Somewhere in that darkness, he knew, the mother bear was awake, waiting. Probably hadn't moved since he left. Josh's eyes didn't leave the cub, but his thoughts flickered to her, to the knowledge that trust, once broken, rarely returned. That if this little heartbeat stopped in the night, something bigger than a life would be lost. Something ancient, fragile, bridge-like. So he fed, watched, waited, and made a silent promise every second. I'm still trying. The air outside bit colder than usual, dry and sharp against Josh's cheeks as he stood motionless on the porch, the snow groaning under his boots. He hadn't expected her, not after 2 days of silence. He'd begun to think the wilderness had swallowed her whole, that maybe she was gone like so many ghosts in this valley, unwitnessed, unheard, unremembered. But there she was. Half shrouded by the dark lattice of pine trunks, she stood motionless. A bronze silhouette against the moon-silvered snow, breath curling in thick clouds from her muzzle. Her eyes found his through the dusk, not wild, not tame, just ancient, present, and waiting. Josh didn't hesitate. Inside the house, the cub stirred at the sound of the wind and Josh's boots on the floorboards. It no longer whimpered with each movement, but it was still fragile, still recovering. Josh crouched by the hearth and ran a calloused hand down its spine once, slow, steady. Then, he lifted the crate he'd prepared and lined with dry fleece, gently placing the cub inside. The little one gave a soft, high grunt. Not fear. Recognition, maybe. Hope. Back on the porch, Josh adjusted his scarf, took one last look at the light bleeding through his window, and walked. The path to the tree line wasn't long, but it felt like a crossing. A threshold between two faiths, the one governed by reason and fence posts, and the one that lived older, deeper, in the muscle memory of wild things. Snowflakes spiraled in the air, catching in his eyelashes. The only sound was the muffled crunch of each footstep and the faint shifting of the crate in his hands. She didn't move as he neared, didn't flinch, only tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging the sacredness of this moment. Josh stopped 10 feet from her and lowered the crate gently onto the snow. He unlatched the side. The cub blinked up at him, blinked at the shadow beyond, then made a small, instinctive sound from the back of its throat. The mother answered, one deep, low huff that vibrated through the ground. Then she stepped forward. No rush, no hesitation. She sniffed the crate once, lowered her great head, and touched the cub's fur with the tip of her nose. A pause, and then, without ceremony, she took it gently in her jaws, like a bundle of breath and trust, and turned. Josh stood there long after she vanished into the timber. The night, for all its cold, felt holy. The snow had thinned into spring mud by the time Josh noticed the first sign. 3 vertical claw marks, precise, deliberate, etched into the bark of the oldest pine at the edge of his land. Not deep enough to damage, just enough to say, I was here. And Josh, dragging fence wire that morning, paused mid-step. He set the coil down slowly, staring at the mark not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that settled deeper than thought. It wasn't threat. It was acknowledgement. More followed. Not daily, not predictably, but enough that Josh began to look without realizing, scanning the tree line as he fed the goats, glancing over his shoulder while chopping wood. One morning he found a trout carcass beside the shed, its skin mostly intact, eyes still glossy, laid atop a flat rock like an offering. Another week, a perfectly whole pine cone, stripped but unsplintered, rested on his porch rail. Sometimes it was tracks, heavy pads imprinted in thawed soil, circling near the tool shed before fading into the brush. They never came too close, never lingered. But they were deliberate. The forest, it seemed, had memory. Josh didn't speak of it, not to the delivery driver who commented on the wild air of his place, not to the neighbor who swore a bobcat was stealing her chickens. This wasn't for them. It wasn't something you passed around over beer or typed into a blog post. It didn't belong in the mouths of strangers. It belonged to silence, to instinct, to a moment when a wild thing met your eyes and chose not to run. The rules he'd once lived by, checklists, guidelines, caution-taped boundaries, meant nothing out here. Not when weighed against that night beneath the cedars. Not when he'd knelt beside a dying cub and a grieving mother and stepped into something ancient, something sacred. He hadn't saved the cub to prove anything. He hadn't hesitated for applause. He'd done it because she asked, not with words, but with trust. And trust like that doesn't vanish in a snowmelt. So when the pine trees whispered on windless days and the forest exhaled a little differently, Josh paused. And he listened, not out of fear, not out of duty, but because when a bear leaves claw marks on your land like brushstrokes on canvas, you don't scrub them clean. You carry them, unseen but permanent, a story not told but lived.